For thousands of years, man has contemplated the construction of utopic city-states and sought the creation of social order under different systems of government. The Greeks had already been living under early forms of democracy when the philosopher Plato wrote the famous Socratic dialogue entitled The Republic, almost 4 centuries before the birth of Christ. A master at rhetoric, logic, and metaphysics, Plato learned his trade under the tutelage of his great teacher, Socrates. Together, along with Plato's student and successor Aristotle, the three would lay the foundations of natural philosophy in the Western tradition. Man is by nature a political animal, Aristotle wrote, and for Plato, political organization and the management of animalistic tendencies in the individual became metaphorical for the organization of social classes in the city-state. Plato knew that integral to the creation of the perfect state was the use of methods intended to purify the populations, as much as they were designed to achieve the qualities of peace, justice, and security. A harmonious society required an unprecedented regime to govern every nuance of its machinery and correct every irregularity that may creep up. In the way of economic organization, Plato was one of the first to recognize a merchant-based system of privatized production and trade. He also envisaged a marketplace for goods facilitated by the use of currency as the main means of exchange. Plato was perhaps the first to realize the contradiction between freedom and order, and that the maximization of order often requires the attenuation of freedom. Freedom is scorned by Plato for it leads to intemperance, and intemperance to the mismanagement of the proper order within the soul, to the detriment of the individual. Likewise, unchecked appetitive drives from the lowly classes in society threaten to upset the pervading order within the state. Democracy, Plato argued, leads to tyranny, tyranny of the majority, but it wasn't a rule of the majority that Plato sought, but rather one of a small minority. In his utopic vision, society would be ruled by a small cadre of enlightened managers that he called philosopher kings. His version was a tyranny of the minority. The state was supreme, so too were its leaders, who in Plato's vision were to be coddled and indoctrinated by the state beginning at infancy and later insulated from the encroachment of the inferior masses. His vision was of an epistemocracy, ruled by a few enlightened, rarefied souls possessing a preponderance of knowledge. Plato's utopic society would be protected by the guardians, born out of a childhood of intense training and cultivation. He wrote, "We must find out who are the best guardians of their conviction that they must always do what they believe to be best for the city. We must keep them under observation from childhood, and set them tasks that are most likely to make them forget such a conviction or be deceived out of it. And we must select whoever keeps on remembering it and isn't easily deceived, and reject the others." Music, poetry, and fables were central to their education. Thus, the storytellers and teachers tasked with educating the guardians would have to be carefully selected and closely monitored. Speaking to this point, Plato wrote, "Don't you understand that we first tell stories to children? These are false on the whole, though they have some truth in them. You know, don't you, that the beginning of any process is most important, especially for anything young and tender. It's at that time that it is most malleable and takes on any pattern one wishes to impress on it. Then we must first of all, it seems, supervise the storytellers, and will persuade nurses and mothers to tell their children the ones we have selected, since they will shape their children's souls with stories much more than they shape their bodies by handling them." Plato also realized the profound effects that music has on the soul, suggesting that differences in rhythm and lyrical composition have a significant influence on personal constitution. He attributed similar value to the other artistic faculties as well.